first mode, therefore, where we consider it as pure consciousness, it does not relate itself as a thinking consciousness to its object, but though it is indeed in itself or implicitly a pure thinking individuality, and its object is just this pure thinking, although the relation of one to the other is not itself pure thinking, it is only a movement towards thinking, and so is devotion. Its thinking as such is no more than the chaotic jingling of bells or a mist of warm incense, a musical thinking that does not get as far as the notion, which would be the sole immanent objective mode of thought. This infinite pure inner feeling does indeed come into possession of its object, but this does not make its appearance in conceptual form, not as something speculatively comprehended, and appears therefore as something alien. What we have here then is the inward movement of the pure heart which feels itself, but itself is agonizingly self-divided. The movement of an infinite yearning which is certain that its essence is such a pure heart, a pure thinking which thinks of itself as a particular individuality, certain of being known and recognized by this object, precisely because the latter thinks of itself as an individuality. At the same time, however, this essence is the unattainable beyond, which in being laid hold of flees, or rather has already flown. It has already flown, for it is in part the unchangeable which thinks of itself as an individuality, and consciousness, therefore, directly attains in it its own self, but as the antithesis of the unchangeable. Instead of laying hold of the essence, it only feels it and has fallen back into itself. Since in attaining itself, consciousness is unable to get away from itself as this antithesis to the unchangeable, it has, instead of laying hold of the essence, only laid hold of what is unessential. Just as on the one hand, when striving to find itself in the essence, it takes hold only of its own separate existence, so on the other hand, it cannot lay hold of the other as an individual or an actual being. Where that other is sought, it cannot be found, for it is supposed to be just a beyond, something that cannot be found. When sought as a particular individual, it is not a universal individuality in the form of thought, not a notion, but an individual in the form of an object, or an actual individual, an object of immediate sense certainty, and for that very reason, only something that has already vanished. Consciousness, therefore, can only find as a present reality the grave of its life. But because this grave is itself an actual existence, and it is contrary to the nature of what actually exists to afford a lasting possession, the presence of that grave, too, is merely the struggle of an enterprise doomed to failure. But having learned from experience that the grave of its actual unchangeable being has no actuality, that the vanished individuality, because it has vanished, is not the true individuality, consciousness will abandon its quest for the unchangeable individuality as an actual existence, or will stop trying to hold on to what has vanished. Only then is it capable of finding individuality in its genuine or universal form. There's a lot of interesting developments going on here in this very long paragraph 217, which can be said to be fundamentally about a comportment, and let's call it by the translator's term, devotion, in German Andacht, which Hegel is going to tell us is not actually thinking itself, but merely a movement towards thinking, and which he is going to connect with feeling, with Gefühl. Now, there's some plays on words going on there, because Andacht, is related to some of the cognates of denken, but we don't need to go into all of that, because it's more plays on words than anything particularly helpful in unpacking the content here. What we've got going on is an exploration of one of the main ways that people do, in fact, throughout history and even in the present, try to connect themselves up with what we can conceptualize either in terms of pure thinking or in terms of the unchangeable, the other pole of this disconnection between the individual and something transcending the individual on the other side. Now, what is going to happen here? Hegel is going to say there's some sort of relation between the pure thinking individuality. So what we're doing here is we're exploring that first mode still of how the individual tries to connect up with the unchangeable, pure consciousness, right? And by the end of this passage, by the way, we're going to have already shifted to the incarnate, unchangeable, and have explored that a bit. And then in the next paragraph, we'll shift back to the side of the subject over here. So we've got subject, we've got its object, it's attempting to think pure thinking, but it doesn't actually think it. He says, in this first mode, therefore, where we consider it as pure consciousness, it, meaning what? The individual, the pure consciousness, does not relate itself as a thinking consciousness to its object, but though it is indeed in itself or implicitly a pure thinking individuality, it just doesn't realize that it's a pure thinking individuality, and that its object is just this pure thinking, it is only a movement towards thinking, and so is devotion. And he tells us, too, the relation of the one to the other is not itself pure thinking. What does that mean? What are some of the implications of that? Well, this relationship itself that I've sort of facetiously labeled here, thinking light, right, is actually going to be a contingent one. It is contingent in that it is conditioned by where the individual finds him or herself, the resources he or she has at their disposal in trying to make sense of this. All sorts of other contingent factors could fall in there as well. So he says, this is only devotion. And here he says something really interesting. Its thinking as such is no more than the chaotic jingling of bells or a mist of warm incense, a musical thinking that does not get so far as the notion, as far as the Begriff. So what is going on when people engage, let's shift gears a little bit, in what Hegel denounces as edification as opposed to rigorous scientific thinking about things? Well, there's an appeal to the essential, but the essential is grasped in the mode on the part of the subject, not of concepts, but of feelings, or in an affective way. What's wrong with this? Well, it doesn't yield us what the notion or the concept, the Begriff, does, which is, as he says, the sole immanent objective mode of thought, where thought is the thinking, is not only aware of its object, but of itself as its subject and how it's historically conditioned and how it can overcome that historical conditioning. And this whole thing is connected together in a coherent, systematic perspective that is able to take into account the dynamism involved, the case in which things seem to be in opposition but aren't really in opposition, where we move from one level to another, how the different things. This is all of what's wrapped up in conceptual thinking. And so what we're getting here in terms of what people facetiously, in terms of religious service, call smells and bells, is a really impoverished type of thinking. It is still thinking. It is still consciousness. So when religious believers, for example, are going to a ritual and they're sort of mumbling along or getting really enthusiastic about it, they are actually doing something distinctively human that is, Hegel thinks, very important. But it's not getting them to the object that they're actually trying to relate themselves to. As a matter of fact, they might be going just to enjoy themselves, or because that's the only way in which they can conceive of connecting themselves with the divine, the transcendent, the universal. But Hegel's saying that there's something more than just thinking light. So, musical thinking. What does he mean by that? Music can be something very, very deep, very profound, but music is very difficult to articulate in conceptual terms. Here, I think, we see a definite, predilection on Hegel's part, going against whatever cannot be coherently articulated, even if it does grip us, for what can, in fact, be laid out and made not necessarily, schematic, but at least conceptualized. So he goes on and he says, this infinite pure inner feeling, that's what's going on there. it is infinite, and it is an inner feeling. So it is grasping the unchangeable. It is grasping the transcendent, but it's not grasping it in the right way, even though it is reaching out to its infinity. He says it does indeed come into possession of the object, but this does not make its appearance in conceptual form, not as something speculatively comprehended, and therefore appears as something alien. Why does this appears as something alien make any difference for us? Well, remember what Hegel has been saying about the unhappy consciousness from the start. The unhappy consciousness involves this scission or split into the two sides, both of which are actually consciousness, but consciousness itself is estranged within itself. The individual who is contingent, who does not have full meaning in and of him or herself, and then the universal, the unchangeable, the eternal, the transcendent. And both of these are indeed consciousness, and the unhappy consciousness is unhappy precisely because it does not realize that these are, in fact, both what it is. And it thinks, how do I get from here to here, right? Without losing here, and without, destroying here. How do I accomplish that? So the unhappy consciousness is trying to grasp its object, not realizing that that object is part of itself. In doing so, it treats that side as if it's something alien to itself, something that is fundamentally unlike, or, as Rudolf Otto said in terms of the experience of the holy other, right? Hegel thinks that that's a mistaken perspective, but one that we have to work our way past. We can't just say, oh, it's a mistake, the divine, I'm perfectly fine with it. No, we have to connect ourselves up with it, and if we don't have the full resources of conceptual thinking, the way in which we do that is through devotion, through feeling. And so he says, what we have here is the inward motion of the pure heart. And, when we talk about somebody having a pure heart, or being pure of heart, or having a good heart, or all these other things, what we typically mean is something that is at the, and I'm going to use a play on words here for those of you that are Latin speakers, at the core of the person, right? Something that really is who that person is. And it's where they not only do their thinking, but also their feeling. The biblical heart of man, the fool says in his heart there is no God. It means the fool actually thinks that, but the fool also feels that, right? And so when we talk about being grieved in our heart, or anything using that locution of the heart, we're talking about something that is really at the center of what a person is. So this is very important. What's going on there? He says, this is the pure heart which feels itself, right? So there's a reflexive relation there. The pure heart is not only feeling its way towards the pure thinking, the unchangeable. I've put this bracket here to represent the pure heart actually being what we might call a relation, right? A way of relating oneself to that through the feeling, through the devotion. But the pure heart is also feeling itself. It is related to itself. And what does it feel? He says it feels itself as agonizingly self-divided. The movement of an infinite yearning which is certain that its essence is such a pure heart, a pure thinking which thinks of itself as a particular individuality, certain of being known and recognized by this object, precisely because the latter thinks of itself as an individuality. Now this is some very rich description here on Hegel's part. He's doing great phenomenology, we could say. What is it to have this religious attitude or comportment of devotion towards the transcendent? This is one of the main modes in which people do that. It's one of the higher modes, in fact. It's better than just, praying to God, won't you give me a Mercedes Benz like you've been giving it to that rich guy over there? This has to do with the very essence of the person relating themselves to what they feel has infinite importance, what could give their life meaning. It's done through feeling. The pure heart is, in fact, an infinite yearning because its object is infinite and the subject is infinite. The pure heart is agonizingly self-divided because it does not yet realize that it already possesses its object. Yet at the same time, notice that Hegel is talking about a personal, or at least personalized, relation between the divine or the universal and the individual human being. Let me read that one more time. He says, it's a pure thinking which thinks of itself as a particular individuality, right? I understand myself as Greg Sadler when I'm, saying my liturgy of the hours or something like that. And what I'm doing is understanding myself as being known and recognized. Known and recognized by what's on this side. By the transcendent. Why? Because the transcendent itself is an individuality. It's not just an abstract force. It's not just some sort of principle. It's not a dead and uncaring universe. It's something that actually pertains to the human being that I am, even though I am just, dirt and ashes mixed together with some fairly incoherent thoughts that run into each other from time to time, and an appearance on, camera, and, add all these other things up. The thing that you hang clothes on. We can come up with all sorts of ways of expressing our contingency. Some of them very ancient, some of them very modern. The thing that ties are made to be strung on. All of these express not only our contingency, but the fact that on this side, the essential, the universal, recognizes us in this relation, this feeling of the pure heart. So he goes on and he says, at the same time, this essence is the unattainable beyond, which in being laid hold of, flees, or rather has already flown. This is a problem that Augustine in particular struggled with. How is it, if we understand the unchangeable and the eternal and the universal as God, how is it that God can enter into our hearts? How does the infinite enter into the finite? We might ask the same question as Kierkegaard does a little bit later from Hegel in his philosophical fragments. How does, in fact, the eternal enter into a moment of time? This is not something that Kierkegaard is the first to ask, but it is something that he poses in a particularly effective way. How is it that what seems to be finite can contain the infinite without being burst asunder, without being effaced, without being nullified? How is it that I'm able to have not only an experience, but a rich experience of something that I cannot yet conceptualize and that I have a feeling about and some sort of dim ideas, but can't wrap my arms around? Anselm asked this question in the Proslogion. Oh Lord, how is it that I'm able to know all these things about you and then, at the same time not see you and not really know anything about you anyway? Is it because of the inaccessible light in which you dwell? How do I penetrate into that? These are really fundamental questions that Hegel is getting to the crux of here in this section. And by pointing at this comportment, this emotional attitude of the pure heart, he's not just talking about some shifting mood that we feel and then stop feeling. He's talking about something that goes to the very ground of a person. This is what religious experience, when it truly is religious experience, often involves. So in addition to the reaching out to the infinite, there's also the sense of the infinite infinitely receding from us, as he says. He says it's already flown. It is in part the unchangeable, which thinks of itself as an individuality, and consciousness therefore directly attains in its own self, but as the antithesis of the unchangeable. Instead of laying hold of the essence, it only feels it and has fallen back into itself. So the pure heart, in its grasping of the infinite, of the essential, it's not able to sort of, you might say, stabilize it in terms of the notion, the concept, the begriff. It's not able to stabilize itself in relation to it. And so what it's left with ultimately is this mode of feeling. And it will go through this. This is a fluid, dynamic relation. You know, it'll wake up each day and say, how can I come to know God? This is the quest of the monks in the desert. Let me try again. Let me get up, dust myself off, and start my prayers and see what happens. Why does consciousness do that? Because it has not yet attained to something that is going to prove more adequate. He goes on and he says, here we go. In attaining itself, consciousness is unable to get away from itself as this antithesis to the unchangeable. In realizing what one is in relation to the transcendent or the divine, there is a grasping of one's own inadequacy to not only articulate or even understand, but even enter in fully into relation with the essential. You know, you might say that we're so far removed because of our contingency from the essential that we don't even have an essential way of framing how things are screwed up. Every time that we do it, we go through a dialectic in which we find out that things are not, our expression for it is not entirely adequate. So he says, it's unable to get away from itself as this antithesis to the unchangeable, this opposition. So it has, instead of laying hold of the essence, only laid hold of what is unessential. And we find over and over again, when we look at accounts of religious reflection and experience, people saying stuff like that. You know, again, if I want to use Anselm's Proslogion, which some people see as, you know, sort of the ultimate rationalist document, because he's trying to attain, you know, knowledge about God and all these different things merely by using the mind itself, which Hegel, by the way, would be all for. What is Anselm actually saying over and over again at each point? I don't really understand. I haven't sufficiently grasped what it is for this to be this case. I run into obstacles. The transparency and intelligibility that I am able to grasp doesn't get me to the fullness of what I'm trying to grasp. This runs throughout his works. This runs throughout so many other people's works. Hegel is providing us here with a way of understanding why that would be the case. He goes on and he says, when striving to find itself in the essence, it takes hold only of its own separate existence. So, on the other hand, it cannot lay hold on the other as an individual or as an actual being. Why not? It was trying to do that. Isn't that the second mode that we're going to explore here in the future paragraphs? Why? Where that other is sought, it cannot be found, for it is supposed to be just a beyond, something that cannot be thought. If you find God in terms of this guy right here, there's something disappointing about that, right? we make movies about that. You know, this contingent shape is supposed to be the transcendent, the divine. We can also say this about, political movements that are invested with the same sort of religious attitude and ethos and affectivity that people have invested into religion, or other things. We meet the person and we're kind of let down. We say, there must be something more that I'm not getting here. He says, what is sought, when sought as a particular individual, then it's not a universal individuality in the form of thought. Not a notion, but an individual in the form of an object, or an actual individual. What we want, Hegel thinks, is really the notion, the Begriff. We also want to be part of that. And so when we try this other strategy of giving the universal, giving the unchangeable, giving the divine, giving the transcendent some sort of shape, a gestalt, we make it into an embodied or a incarnate, as we've been translating here, a gestaltete, individual or universal, then we wind up not being fully content with what it is that we're able to grasp. So he says, why not? This becomes an object of immediate sense certainty. For that reason, only something that's already vanished. So, what is the upshot of this? Consciousness can only find as a present reality, here's another great theme, the grave of its life, the God, the grave, where you put the dead things, right? So what is the grave of its life? The fundamental disappointment in trying to attain what it was that it was after. You know, when people think that, you know, Hegel is somehow some Pollyannish optimist, they should read this section, because he is being, you know, very explicit here that this comportment of devotion is not just, you know, well, it's going to make me feel good, and I'll be connected with the divine, or at least what I think of the divine, and everything's going to be A-okay. No, if consciousness really follows this out, you've got these two sides, the pure heart, which is in agony, because it cannot really attain its object, and it's hyper-aware of itself, and where it leads to is the grave of its life. What's the good news here, though? The grave can't be the final answer. He says, just because this grave is itself an actual existence, a Wirklichkeit, an actuality, and it is contrary to the nature of what actually exists to afford a lasting possession, this too cannot remain. This too must pass away. This too is something that the individual confronts and can get beyond. He says it's the struggle of an enterprise itself doomed to failure. So failure itself is doomed to failure, you might say. Then he says, but having learned from experience that the grave of its actual unchangeable being has no actuality, that the vanished individuality, because it has vanished, is not the true individuality, consciousness will abandon its quest for the unchangeable individuality as an actual existence, or will stop trying to hold on to what has vanished. Only then is it capable of finding individuality in its genuine or universal form. That's a very pregnant passage. What is Hegel talking about there? One way of interpreting this is of what has been called demythologization. So we've got the individual human being, the consciousness, trying to relate itself to the pure, unthinking, the unchangeable, which could be understood as essence, could be understood as individuality. And whenever we visualize it, or we might say enflesh it as a real, a wirklich, an actual individual, we find two things going on. We find that this pureness, this essentiality to it, ends up sort of escaping us. And we say, what, this guy? This place? This temple? This right? This determinate thing is supposed to encompass the divine? The divine that we're having a hard time getting ourselves in contact with and wrapping our heads around? Well, maybe the eternal enters into time in a different way. Not through this individual or that individual, but rather through what that individual means. That could be something that would be graspable in terms of the Hegelian concept, the Begriff, the notion, as it's translated here. Now, what would that be, say, in the case of Christianity? Christianity is one of the religions that you can bet that Hegel really has in mind when he's talking about the divine or the universal becoming incarnate. Because you've got this Jesus guy, this person who is, said to be, and who, in the canonical descriptions of himself, says that he himself is God, the divine, that he is the mediator, that he is the presence of the divine. And then you get, the Trinity as well coming in, either in an implicit way or in a very explicitly developed way as the community, notice the importance there, the community comes to better understand itself in relation to the revelation that has taken place. The revelation being a relation of the transcendent back to the concrete individual. Now, what the demythologizers proposed is that we shouldn't be so concerned about the actual individual historical person of Jesus, of Nazareth, but rather in what he was taken to be and what the meaning of that was for that community and what the meaning ends up being throughout history and what it can be for us today. It leads to some rather strange things like Rudolf Bultmann, for example, asserting that because we can flick a light switch on and off, that we can't read Scripture in the same way anymore, which is a little bit, stretching things. But there is something to it, and Hegel is writing at the time when these thoughts are actually in ferment. So I think that you can read that in here to what he's saying. Having learned from experience the grave of its actual unchangeable being has no actuality, that the vanished individuality, because it has vanished, is not the true individuality, consciousness will abandon its quest for the unchangeable individuality as an actual existence, and instead, like it says, stop trying to hold on to what has vanished. Only then is it capable of finding individuality in its genuine or universal form. What is the individuality in its genuine or universal form? Well, you already know where we're going in this section because Hegel has laid it out in the previous paragraphs. We're looking to get beyond all of this and to spirit, which is going to be, or Geist, a reconciliation of the individual and pure thinking, or the reconciliation of the individual and the unchangeable, where there's an identity going on, but an identity in difference. Instead of it being primarily the difference that stands out, it's going to be the linking back together, the identification, if we want to make it a more active verb in this case. Identification understood as a process, not simply as a fact, right? So that is a real important turning point here in grasping what is going on and what the prospects are for this attitude of devotion. We see that it's not getting us quite where we want to go, but we've uncovered phenomenologically some very important characteristics of the religious comportment of the individual human being in the unhappy consciousness.